this is the worst political, foreign policy, defense disaster involving the West probably since the Second World War.
Folks, as you know, social media censorship is growing. The best way to support our video work for Israel is to subscribe to our video newsletter on pulseofisrael.com and to share our videos. If you are already a subscriber, then thank you. Today we have a very, very special and important guest, Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp actually was sent to Kabul, Afghanistan in 2003 to lead the British forces there. He also happens to be a huge friend of the Jewish state of Israel, a fighter for truth in TV studios and online. And it is wonderful to be able to have Colonel Kemp with us today to hear his thoughts on the latest with Afghanistan and the connection to Israel. Shalom, shalom, Colonel Kemp. How are you?
Shalom. I'm very well and very pleased to be with you. And unfortunately not in person, but this is the next best thing.
Yes, we were just saying how we missed the opportunity to be in person when you were here in Israel. But yeah, definitely. And you know, before going into the real information and strategic information about what happened with Afghanistan and implications for Israel, I just want to hear your personal thoughts. I mean, you put your life on your line. You were in charge of troops. I'm sure you had many successes, a number of failures. How does the recent news of what the Biden administration has done with Afghanistan, how does that make you feel personally with the investment, your life investment in that project?
Well, I personally feel extremely sorry for the people of Afghanistan, who are the ones who will have to bear the brunt of President Biden's decision. In other words, be governed by one of the most ruthless regimes that the world's ever known, certainly in recent years. And we know what the Taliban did to them when they were there before. And I think we have the best indication of how terrified many people are when we see the imagery of Afghan people clinging to the side of taxiing aircraft, and in some cases falling off as it gets into the sky, which, you know, indicates how much fear they have of remaining in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. And I think, you know, when I think back to 2003, when I went to Afghanistan, the people were very optimistic. They were extremely grateful to us for releasing them from the shackles of the Taliban. They were looking forward. They were promised a much freer future, more prosperous future, free of the Taliban. And the only people I ever met in Afghanistan who did not like the fact that we were there were the terrorists that we arrested. And everyone else was very happy. And now, you know, they're suffering and will be suffering even more in coming years. I think the other people I feel very sorry for are the citizens of most Western countries who now face a dramatically increased threat to all of them from terrorism emerging from Afghanistan.
So let me ask the following question, because even though today, obviously, President Biden is getting the attention because it was his decision to pull out, it was his intention to set a deadline, which, if you ask me, listen, I'm no military strategist, but he basically empowered the Taliban by setting a self-imposed deadline. But even President Trump voiced his desire to take out U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And regardless of what president, I'm sure at some point in time, U.S. troops would have been taken out. What could or should have been done differently with a U.S. pullout to ensure a safe future for those peaceful, loving Afghanis in terms of continuing to take care of Taliban and allow them to have a better life?
Well, President Trump's decision to pull out was also a mistake, and yet he wasn't up for doing it as President Biden did. He had applied conditions to the U.S. withdrawal, which actually were not being met, and whether he would have gone ahead with it without those conditions being met, we don't know. What we do know is that President Biden did go ahead with it without any conditions whatsoever being applied to the Taliban, and seems to have spent most of his time since coming under attack for his catastrophic decision, blaming Trump for it. He's actually the president. He's been the president for 7 months. He claims that he was bound by the Trump decision. Of course he wasn't. He spent most of his term as president so far, undoing pretty much everything Trump ever did. So why shouldn't he undo this? He's just trying to shift the blame onto everybody else except himself. And as to what should have been done differently, I can't think of any way in which this withdrawal could have been done worse. I don't agree with it in the first place, but let's assume that, which is the case, that it had to happen and that President Trump made the decision, therefore we had to go. First of all, when the US withdrew, all other Western forces also had to withdraw. They were not capable, any of them, including Britain, were not capable of remaining in Afghanistan without the Americans, so they all had to go. Secondly, I think he gave the Afghans far too short a time. He did it very quickly. From his decision until the withdrawal was a very short space of time. He didn't give them the chance to get used to the idea, to even believe he was going. He didn't give them the chance to plan and prepare for a totally new situation, unexpected situation. On top of that, he then withdrew very quickly all of the support to the Afghan forces, including technical support, logistic support, etc., and air power, which didn't need to be withdrawn in the way it was. There was some air power remaining as the fight went on, but not very much. And then finally, or almost finally, he chose to withdraw at the height of the Taliban fighting season. This is the time when they're most active. If he'd waited until the autumn or winter, the Taliban are far less, operate far less. They would have been much less likely to have effected this very quick operation to take over the country if it was in the winter when the Americans left. At least it would have left a buffer between the withdrawal and the full takeover, which I think would have had some advantages. And finally, the withdrawal, the actual withdrawal, the evacuation of civilians and American, British citizens, etc. That should have started months ago. When he made the decision, that's when it should have started. We would not have seen these awful scenes that are both devastating for human beings, but also devastating for the reputation of the United States of America and NATO and the rest of the world, the Western world. Because we've now seen, effectively, we've seen Western forces, American forces, NATO forces, British forces appear to be running away under fire with rocket attacks on the airport, with suicide bomb attacks taking place. The optics of that are so serious, apart from the human devastation. It couldn't have been worse.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking, and love to hear your feedback, is America and the freedom-loving world comes out looking so weak. One, because of what you're just talking about right now, the fast pullouts, and the fact that American citizens and Afghanis who are working with the Americans are left back there stranded to be attacked or persecuted by the Taliban. And President Biden specifically said, no one's going to be left there. Just a month ago, on July 8th, in an interview, I mean, this is just a month ago. It's not even history. President Biden in an interview said, oh, no, everything's going to be fine. The Afghani army is going to be strong and the Taliban are never going to take over. And with all of this unfolding, to me, it looks like a total embarrassment, not for the President of the United States, but for America and the freedom-loving world, and a total win and motivation for, again, the growing Islamic jihadi world. Am I off on that assessment?
No, you're absolutely right. And it's not just a win for the jihadist world. And I would say this is the greatest victory for jihadists anywhere in the world, probably since the Iranian Revolution, and
wow,
maybe even more than that, in 1979. So it is a massive victory, which will strengthen them. It will give them confidence, inspiration, energize them. It will increase their funding. It will increase recruiting for them. It is a huge victory for jihad, unfortunately. But not only that, there's no countries more gleeful about what happened here than China and Russia, and we have to confront China and Russia constantly. And President Biden gave as one of his excuses for an unconditional withdrawal that he had to focus US resources more on China and Russia, who were challenging us. But actually, this has had the opposite effect, because what it will have done is embolden China and Russia. They will no longer see the US as being in any way a strong country. They already push us in various different ways, exploiting what they consider to be our weaknesses. But whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in the South China Sea, wherever it is, it happens. And this will encourage them more. They will see that we're even weaker than they thought. And those countries that we had hoped to entice not to align themselves with China and Russia, but to align themselves with us, who may be wavering or not, they will ask, why would we? This is, the Americans, the West, are fair weather allies. China and Russia are going to be far more reliable when the chips are down. So why would we do this? It's a defeat for the West in so many ways. Its consequences are really, I think, incalculable.
Wow. And on the heels of this, we just had new Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, have a meeting with President Biden. And on a personal level, and someone involved with Israeli politics, I couldn't help but think, wait a second, is this really the best time for the Prime Minister of Israel to meeting President Biden when the whole world is looking at him as president and the United States in such a weak place in terms of not being reliable on the world stage for any potential promises? So again, you're very familiar with Israel and the Middle East. What are the takeaways you think the Israeli politicians and the state of Israel should be taking from this Afghanistan disastrous pullout?
Well, I think already in the Middle East, and I recognize, as I'm sure you recognize, that the United States is the greatest and strongest ally of the state of Israel. And Israel has to rely on the US. And does rely on the US, and it's right that it should do so. But this kind of adds to, I think, the question marks that have existed for quite a long time about US policy in the Middle East, and the extent to which the US can be relied upon by its allies. And we saw this emerging mainly initially probably under President Obama, when he decided to try and give hegemony in the Middle East to Iran, and he negotiated a really extremely bad nuclear deal with Iran, empowering Iran and terrifying pretty much everyone else in the Middle East. And this now, and also early under the Biden presidency, he then basically turned his back on Saudi and refused to support Saudi's the war that Saudi is fighting in Yemen, basically against the Iranians. And this terrifies Saudi Arabia, the UAE, many other countries in the region. And now Biden adds to it, because there will be, particularly countries like Saudi and Jordan and the UAE and various other countries will be really concerned now about the extent to which they can count on American support after this fiasco in Afghanistan, which is being watched by everybody. And the other side of the coin is that it will empower Iran. Iran already is extremely aggressive across the region against Israel and against other countries and against the Sunni world. And Iran will now see that there's not really any reason not to increase its levels of aggression. Plus the fact that Iran, there are differing views on Iran's relationship with the Taliban, but what I do know is that Iran funded and supported, armed the Taliban, gave them safe haven in Iranian territory during the 20-year campaign, and paid them to kill Americans and British. And as a result of that support, I think it's quite likely that Iran will have additional leverage in Afghanistan now that it didn't have before. So overall, there's been an enormous weakening, I think, of confidence in the US among countries in the region, and enormous strengthening of the aggression of Iran.
Interesting. So it sounds like, as a takeaway from what you're saying, that the whole direction of, in a sense, the Abraham Accords of Israel strengthening relations with some of the Sunni Muslim countries as to get together and be better prepared against an aggressive Iran, it just pushes Israel to even further these relations, or even make relations with even more of these Sunni Muslim countries with the growing, not just Iran, but also Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it could strengthen it could strengthen the Abraham Accords, but of course the Abraham Accords depended quite heavily on US backing, and of course President Biden has not been the strongest backer of the Abraham Accords. I believe, you know, the White House and the State Department don't even allow the words Abraham Accords to be used in relation to this matter. So yeah, it could have a positive benefit from that point of view, but I think the overall benefit, the overall effect will be very much negative rather than positive. And I think, you know, I believe if another thing, and it's really speculation, I haven't seen any evidence for it yet, but President Biden will obviously be deeply conscious of the damage this fiasco has done to his administration. And it may be his calculation, I'm sure his calculation will be that people will have forgotten this horrific situation come the midterm elections and come the next presidential elections. That will be forgotten, and what will be remembered is that he was the one that pulled America out of Afghanistan, which I'm sure is a popular move because the consequences of it have not been explained to the American electorate. So I think he will be, that's what his calculation will still be. But I do believe that he will also be looking around for, you know, as quickly as he can, for other foreign policy successors that he can try and chalk up to his name, and that might include, for example, you know, initiating a peace process, so-called, in the Middle East,
right?
You know, in the hope of getting some gain from that. We don't know, but it's something to watch, I think.
Interesting. Thanks for the warning, Colonel. I just hope more Israelis are waking up and realizing that, wait, specifically this Afghanistan fiasco shows how much we cannot rely on a U.S. administration. I mean, any U.S. administration, even if we rely on promises of one president, administrations change, and then you end up with a president that stabs you in the back and goes against past promises. I mean, the best example of this, meaning the best connection to Afghanistan, is back during the Obama presidency. It was John Kerry who invited then Prime Minister Netanyahu to Afghanistan, saying, look, we're going to do this for you. Just let us do this for you and set up something similar, because the U.S. forces already trained the Palestinian Authority as part of that model. And they were going to say, oh, and we'll take care of security of the Jordan border, Jordan Valley, et cetera, et cetera. And Netanyahu basically said, no thanks, no thanks. I'm not going there. I'm not looking at it. We're not going to rely on you. But I hope most Israelis wake up and say, wait a second, we have to rely on ourselves while relying on what we have to in America, but not necessarily on promises like that are similar to an Afghanistan situation.
Well, I would say that this Afghanistan situation has really underlined Israel's policy of defending itself by itself. Yes, it does have to depend on US financial assistance and technological assistance and also diplomatical assistance sometimes. But I think, you know, this puts me in mind of the proposal under the Kerry-Obama peace process that US forces should come and take over the security of the West Bank from Israel. And there was a plan drawn up by an American General John Allen, very respected general, which saw US forces being in the West Bank instead of Israeli forces. And I think many of us at the time, when that plan was put forward, expressed huge concern that it was just not possible to rely on something like that, because when things got difficult, maybe you know, the initial administration that initiated something like that might have been able to stand by it, but what would the next administration do, etc. And when the first Americans started getting killed in the West Bank, how long would it be before the plug was pulled? And I think this underlines the wisdom of Israel in utterly rejecting that proposal.
Right, and just to add, like, part of the Jewish thinking is, wait a second, we don't want any foreign soldiers dying on our land in the name of defending us, because the second that starts to happen, first of all, public opinion in said country, let's say America, will turn against having those soldiers. But not only that, public opinion will then, they blame Israel. which then leads to growth of anti-Semitism, blaming the Jew. Oh, my son, my cousin, this U.S. soldier died trying to defend the Jewish state of Israel. And that's an additional level of concern where we, as the Jewish state, we don't want any foreign soldiers ever to be placed here to have to be in a situation of potentially losing their lives in a sense of defending us. We want to stand up and defend ourselves and take that burden upon ourselves. Yeah. Well, Colonel, it is a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your insight. Any final message you want to give across, whether continuing the concern or some thoughts of hope, again, using your personal experience of Afghanistan?
No, I think there's not much room for optimism at the moment. I think, this is the worst political, foreign policy, defense disaster involving the West probably since the Second World War. It might be if you combined Suez in the 1950s and the fall of Saigon in the 1970s. If you combine those two things together, you might somewhere get near it. But it took the Americans 15 years between the fall of Saigon and the successful invasion of Kuwait and Iraq to free Kuwait from Iraqi illegal occupation. It took all that time, 15 years, to recover the reputation of the US and the standing of the US in the world, really, militarily. And this is going to take quite a lot longer, I think. So there's not much room in my view, for an optimistic outlook. I think, but the thing that everyone must strive for, obviously there's got to be the capability to hit the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and other jihadists in Afghanistan, if that can be done when they present a particular threat to the West. That is not going to be easy because we no longer have the same kind of intelligence footprint in Afghanistan as we once had. But all that does have to be done if it can be done. I don't anticipate British, American, Western forces going into Afghanistan again in any strength. I think that's not going to happen. And I also think that where intervention is needed around the world in the future, that's unlikely to happen as well, because this whole experience will traumatize all of our governments. I'm talking about Western governments now. I don't include Israel. Will have traumatized all of our governments to such an extent they will be very reluctant to get into anything like that again. So the key thing from my point of view, the most important thing, is that we do our best to repair the relationships that have been damaged, like the British-American relationship and the whole of NATO, which has been grossly undermined by this thing. So I'm sorry I can't leave you with much hope or optimism, but a couple of thoughts for the future.
Listen, I appreciate it. I appreciate your candor and obviously concern for not just Afghanis, but for the freedom-loving world and humanity. And I guess on that note, just throwing in some Jewish lingo into this, the Jewish people were about to start our holiday of the Jewish New Year, where basically we're praying to the Lord above for the next year to be a good year, a year of health, a year of security, a year of everything. That's what we're praying for. So on that note, with your very real and raw concerns, let's pray for better leadership to really be able to protect humanity and the freedom-loving world from the evil forces that unfortunately right now are growing. Colonel, Amen. Thank you so much for your time.
Amen
what?
To that. Amen to that.
Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you next time when you come to Israel, Colonel.
Likewise, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this fabulous and very important insight from Colonel Richard Kemp. Again, someone who, not just with general knowledge from his military experience, but specific knowledge from being one of the head British soldiers on the ground in Kabul, Afghanistan back in 2003, and obviously hearing his insight regarding the what we take from that regarding Israel and the Middle East. Everyone, signing off for another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our united and undivided capital, Jerusalem. Thanks for watching. Shalom.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.